Thanks to all the panelists for being here tonight. What I'd like to do is just kind of jump right into the issue, and the first topic on the agenda is how long will the shale boom last? So we'll try to dissect that. And I think maybe the best way to start out is talking about the oil side of the equation. When we talk about the shale boom, of course, we talk about natural gas as well as oil, but I think oil is what most everybody's focused on right now. So maybe we can start out with that side of things. We're looking at about a 24-year high in domestic oil production, which is pretty incredible. It's something most people didn't see coming even 5-6 years ago. We've seen some projections recently that it could last for another 10 years, maybe another 5 years, maybe longer, maybe less. So let's try to get a handle on what this boom means and how long it's likely to continue. And maybe we'll just start, Ken, down with you, and we'll just work our way up the table.
Sure. Great question. I think the studies Loren's referring to, there have recently been 2 pieces of work issued by the International Energy Agency out of Paris and the Energy Information Administration out of DC. The IEA's is probably the most widely quoted. It's sort of talking about how the run-up in oil production in the United States is going to last probably till about 2020, and then you'll see a peak and gradual decline. I always find these kinds of questions interesting because one of the things that's always left out of the discussion is price. I mean, that's really critical, and if you're going to try to start thinking about how long oil production is going to continue to increase. I think if we, and this is based on the work we've done here at the Baker Institute, but I think if we see prices in excess of $100 for the foreseeable future, there's a good 10 to 15 years of growth left in domestic oil supply. However, if we start to see the sort of wheels fall off of a $100 engine and we dip down into the $80 or even $70 range, then you're talking about a much shorter-lived kind of peak. So I think that's a really important aspect of anything that we're going to talk about if we're going to talk about growth in domestic production.
Scott?
Yeah, so when I started in the business in 1982, I got sit rigs, and you drop a bit down in the earth and take a rock core. And it used to be if you cored a shale, you lost your job because you missed your core point for the real reservoirs. But in doing that, we always saw natural gas kicks and oil seeping out of some of these shales. So it's not like we didn't know it was there. You got a convergence today of technology and price. So some horizontal drilling, the ability to crack the rocks, special proppants, the ability to steer wells in the reservoir, called geosteering, et cetera, that have really come together to allow the production of the source rock. So that's where the oil and gas is formed. All the conventional stuff, that's just what leaked off. That's what we've been producing for the last many years. Now we're down in the source rocks. There's a lot there. We won't get most of it out. We don't even get most out of conventional reservoirs. It's hard. It doesn't like to come out. So I think one of the questions on how long will it last is not just prices, and Ken is exactly right on that, but what are the technologies that are going to come about to allow for more extraction? And price and demand drive those things. It's amazing how much invention goes on when there's demand for it. And I'm always surprised by the kinds of things that we invent to do things. So technology weighs pretty heavy. And I think it's hard to forecast, but certainly there's a lot there in the world in shales. Shale is the most common sedimentary rock.
I like to point out to people that, first of all, the United States is the most mature petroleum province on Earth, and therefore the so-called shale revolution is in many ways more of a retirement party. We've exhausted all the attractive opportunities, and now we're down literally to the bottom of the barrel trying to produce, and producing successfully, oil from its source rocks. And I think Ken led us in the right direction initially, which was we have to look at cost. I would add a corollary to that, and that is that there has not been to date, and will not be in the future, anywhere near enough capital generated by demand to keep this thing going. The industry is running at about a $50 billion a year deficit between the money it needs to spend and the cash flow that it takes in. So we're seeing a convergence right now of a last gasp effort to squeeze the last oil that this poor country has left in it, and by the way, produce it just as fast as we can. We're seeing now that we're going to have to export a little bit of oil. So we, for all the conservation conscious here, that apparently is not a big concern. But the real story is that we're living in a very unusual period because of financial difficulty, where people with money can't make any money. If you've tried to get any money out of your savings account on interest, you know that. So money is looking for a home, and a lot of the capital in the world is coming to the U.S. energy sector for a variety of reasons that I won't go into right now. So really what I think is going to control how long this boom lasts is how long does this apparently endless flow of excess capital last. That's really what's going to happen. And to Ken's point also, of course, cost matters. We saw this week that crude oil in the Bakken Shale in North Dakota is down to $71.25 a barrel. That means an awful lot of those operations are at best marginal and probably not profitable. So little swings on a very expensive operation, that's the other point, make a big difference.
Well, let's follow up on that, and I'll let whoever wants to jump in and address this jump in on it. But what we're really getting to here is sort of the global market for oil and how that's going to affect price, how global demand is going to affect price, and what we're seeing with some of these sort of regional pockets that we've seen because of the sudden rise in shale. So maybe talk a little bit about what's going to happen with global prices relative to this sort of abundance of cheap money.
That's a great question, and if I had the perfect crystal ball, I wouldn't tell any of you the answer because I'd go out and make a bunch of money. But certainly when you look at the global crude oil market, that's something that you have to remember. It is global. Art just mentioned prices in the Bakken. Those are largely, when you see these disconnects between crudes, particularly light crudes, in terms of price, they're largely driven by constraints. And so when you have a significant constraint, it actually signals an opportunity to invest, and so it's going to attract capital into the sector to move the crude away from the shale. Now, what does that mean going forward? It means ultimately you're going to have to get some resolution on things like the Keystone Pipeline, get some resolution on what long-haul infrastructure opportunities there are, get some resolution on things like, will the U.S. become a crude oil exporter? Lisa Murkowski actually just made an announcement through her office that she's going to start to focus on this issue. So I would anticipate early next year you begin to see some hearings up on Capitol Hill looking at the oil export ban. So these are things that are going to be coming to a head. They're going to be very central to the policy discussion, and quite frankly are going to drive the long-term success or failure of what's going to happen domestically with crude oil production. The market is global. Oil will find a home. Oil is the most fungible global energy commodity that there is. So the price is not going to be set by what we do here. It's going to be set by a culmination of events that occur all over the world, and that's something we have to keep in mind. So to the extent that sanctions remain on countries like Iran, and you continue to see less production out of that particular part of the world, then U.S. crude oil production effectively, if it is exported, serves to offset the upward pressure on price that those kind of sanctions exert. Because you're going to continue to see demand growth in Asia. I don't see the wheels coming off the Chinese miracle anytime real soon. So, when you sort of bring all that into focus, you see a long-term kind of oil price, and I say long-term kind of loosely, but over the next 10 to 15 years, that's probably north of $80. That, of course, is barring any major disturbance, like another major global financial meltdown, something like that, and then all bets are off. But certainly I think there's enough strength, enough demand pull, and enough constraint on the supply side of the equation to leave us in an environment where prices are north of $80 for the foreseeable future.
Go ahead.
So I was born in the Illinois Basin, and we moved to the DJ Basin, and then we moved to the Gulf Basin, then the Anadarko Basin, then back to the DJ, and back to the Gulf Basin, and that was 5th grade. So I was born into the oil and gas business, and there are a lot of reasons people drill oil and gas wells. looking for tax shelters. They might need to hold acreage. They might know something you don't know, or they might be stupid and drill dumb wells. And there are lots of other reasons too. That's been the oil and gas business forever. And it's no different in shale. There's a lot of money. Some are chasing bad opportunities in shale basins. Some get good acreage, some get expensive bad acreage. Some get surprised by what they find. Some don't have a clue what they find, they just keep drilling. And all these things lead to more production. Some of them lose money, some of them make money. Some of them are marginal. And so I guess I would say that's been the oil and gas business forever. Shales are just a different pore system and different scale of that. And I think the point that both Art and Ken make is the demand is there. It's hard to replace oil in this world right now. It's a very dense form of energy, and we need it. Natural gas has a lot of advantages as well. So what you see happening is some capital destruction, some people that are making good money. You can't treat these things as one big average. And I think it's an important point. But I think it's going on just in Shanghai last week, and they're looking at shale basins over there now. And globally, people are starting to try to figure out how they go about it, and technology continues to march on and improve. So we can discuss lots of things, but the fact is, if you look at production curves on oil and gas, they continue to rise so far in the U.S.
I think an important point to take away from this discussion is that despite what you read and despite what you hear, despite whether or not the United States actually surpasses Saudi Arabia and Russia in terms of its crude oil production for 38 seconds or whatever, that's really not the point. The point is that the United States cannot be energy independent in the current circumstance we're in. In the future, all bets are off. But we consume about 15 million barrels a day of crude oil. And we produce, with all this shale oil, less than 8 million barrels a day. So the gap between what we consume and what we produce is profound. It's more than any other country in the world consumes, the gap between what we produce and what we consume. And so when we start talking about exporting crude oil, and we can't even meet our own consumption with our own production, that's when certain people in the public sector, in policy, start to wonder if we're going down the wrong road. Energy is a strategic resource. I'm the last one to suggest that we regulate this, but there is a powerful and effective campaign that's going on right now that says, don't worry, be happy. Everything that you remember from 18 months ago that we're running out of something, it's over. History has changed. Trust us, this time it'll be different. You can go back to buying Hummers if you like. We don't have to worry anymore. And I think that this kind of message is, first of all, it's incorrect, and I don't think anybody on this panel would disagree. And it's dangerous because just because we have it doesn't mean we have to use it up as quickly as possible. We are not going to become energy independent, and we ought to be very careful about how we use our natural resources. So it is great that we have found more to produce, and I agree with Scott on both counts. Number one, in the oil and gas business, we are an undisciplined lot and very much driven by profit, and therefore very much a part of the Texas culture. At the same time, we have to be mindful of the resources that we have and not squander them just because we can.
Well, since Art brought up the issue of energy independence, this was actually a question I was saving for a little later, but let's go ahead and jump into it. I mean, first of all, I'd like to hear thoughts from Ken and Scott on whether they believe energy independence is achievable, but also is it something we should be trying to do? We're talking about one of the largest markets in the world. It seems like there might be a role for the U.S. to be a more active participant in that as opposed to someone that's trying to be independent of that. So maybe you guys could jump in on that.
Sure. I think to aspire to being energy independent can sometimes be dangerous. All you have to do is think back to the 1970s and some of the foolish policies that were adopted, quota systems, things like this on imports. I mean, these things ultimately failed and we had to unwind them. So, the notion is sort of, it's a feel-good notion. I don't think that the United States will ever be, quote-unquote, energy independent. However, when we talk about, and this is where I'll disagree with Art a little bit on the campaign, on the feel-good campaign. When we talk about exporting crude oil, this is really an issue of a mismatch between the type of crude we're producing and the kind of refinery capacity we have in this country. So you're talking about lower cost options to continue to provide the kind of fuels that we need to go about our daily business. So you're really talking about a swap, light sweet crudes for the heavy sours that we can handle on the Gulf Coast. At the end of the day, what that means is ultimately it's an improvement in our balance of trade. Why do I say that? Well, because the light sweet crudes fetch a better price than the heavy sour stuff. And so what you're talking about is an improvement of balance of trade without necessarily meaning that we're becoming more energy independent. In fact, what we'll end up doing is in my mind, if there's a lift on the export ban, we'll end up exporting the light sweet stuff, and we'll continue to import what we've always imported. But we're going to look better off for it. A lot of times people will criticize the notion of exporting crude oil on the grounds that it violates our potential for better energy security. I think that's an ill-founded statement, particularly if you look at a lot of the work that's been done to evaluate the effect of energy prices, crude oil prices in particular, on macroeconomies around the world. Those that have a better balance of trade, those that actually are exporting crudes that fetch a high value in the open market tend to do much better when prices are high. All you need to do is look at the state of Texas to see a microcosm of that. Right, the state of Texas, when energy prices are high, the economy does pretty well. It's very different than other parts of the country where you don't have a tremendous amount of oil production. So you can see that in spades if you just look at the state of Texas. Now, in terms of energy independence, there's another part of this equation. It's not just about supply. It's also about demand. And one of the things that we've seen since 2008 is lower oil demand than we have in many, many years in this country. As a matter of fact, we've still not recovered to where we were in 2007, 2008. Now, why is that? A lot of it has to do with consumer sentiment. What do we demand? We demand more fuel efficiency today than we ever have. Good case in point, and this is just anecdotal, if you turn on the TV and you look at and you're watching television, you see a car commercial, you'll actually see a commercial for the Ford F-150. The very first thing that you'll see is a mention about the efficiency of the vehicle. Hit rewind 10 years, not a single word about efficiency in a commercial for a Ford F-150. Why is that? Well, because consumers demand it. Why? Well, because you look at the price of gasoline today versus what it was 10 years ago, and we're in a very different environment now. And so fuel costs very much drive what consumers demand, and so consumers are more and more demanding efficiency, and I don't think that's going to change. So when we talk about increasing our ability to be more quote-unquote energy independent, not that I think we'll get there, we have to remember there are two sides of the equation, and the demand side of the equation is equally important.
I remember testifying to a Senate hearing, U.S. Senate hearing several years ago on energy independence. And the first three words out of my mouth, and John Cornyn chaired it, he was a new senator then, were, "We can't be." And I wasn't very popular because this was a hearing on energy independence, and didn't I get it? And I look back and, independence sounds great. I mean, we have a declaration of one, right? Who wouldn't want to be that? I don't find it particularly attractive or even a good measure of what we should be striving for. I couldn't agree more with Art on efficiency, conservation, our attitude toward energy. I think it's critical in this country. I think what's important rather than independence is energy security. And let me define what I mean by that. Is it affordable? Is it available? Is it reliable? And is it environmentally sustainable? So those are the four pillars of security: affordable, available, reliable, environmentally sustainable. Affordable drives. It drives energy behavior globally. But environmentally sustainable is one of those 4 pillars now, and they all have to start to dance together. No energy form meets all 4. So we have this portfolio of choices, and it varies by geopolitical region. It depends on what you have. You use what you have where you have it. Depends on where you are economically. Some countries are trying to lift themselves out of poverty. They like to have clothes, a roof, food, and maybe some education. So they're going to use the most affordable energy they can, and you can't tell them they can't do that. Developed nations have different choices and different perspectives on the thing. The U.S. can frame its energy conversation in security, and it helps you to address a lot of the big issues. You know, look at LNG exports or the Keystone Pipeline or anything else. You can frame it in that, and those answers come pretty easily. Instead of trying to pick winners or other things, frame the conversation around security, but include environmental sustainability. Doesn't mean I'm a tree hugger or anything else, whatever we want to, It means I care about the environment and its sustainability, and it can be part and parcel of that conversation. So to me, independence, great. Whoever needs to talk about it to win elections. But I'd prefer us to have an intelligent conversation about how the world goes about becoming energy secure.
Well, let's follow up on the environmental issue, because obviously that's a big part of fracking as well. It's something that many people are very concerned about. One of the things that makes fracking unique is that it has opened up a lot of areas of the country where there's not been a lot of drilling activity in recent years to drilling. And so you in some cases literally have companies drilling in people's backyards, and it's kind of raised maybe an awareness or a closeness of the general public to the oil industry. But let's talk a little bit about the environmental concerns, both real and imagined, and how the industry should be dealing with those.
There was a time when oil and gas drilling, whether there was fracking or not, fracking, as most of you know, is nothing new. It is somewhat new in its current flavor, but it's been around longer than I've been alive. Horizontal drilling is likewise nothing new. The way these two technologies have converged and optimized each other is something new. I certainly agree with that. But in the past, oil and gas was generally produced in some faraway place. It was produced maybe in West Texas or Wyoming, or better yet, Saudi Arabia. And I think that it's symptomatic of the fact that oil and gas is getting harder to find, that now it's creeping into people's backyards in places like Pennsylvania, and people are afraid it'll happen in New York. It's crept into their backyards in Fort Worth. And this is just a natural progression as we become more and more desperate, I guess, for resources, and that's where we are. So, fracking. This is a topic which I think has been extremely effectively exploited by various economic interests to the detriment of the oil and gas business. Is fracking an environmental threat? If it's done correctly, I don't think it is. And I don't think that there's a lot of evidence. If there were a lot of evidence, we'd certainly be hearing about it. There's an awful lot of fear of things that we don't understand. And I would venture to say that there are an awful lot of people, professionals in my own industry, that don't fully understand fracking. I don't. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a completion engineer. So it's easy to make people be afraid of things they don't understand, and especially if they're afraid it's going to happen in their backyard. So let me just quickly say what I would fear about fracking. I would fear the above-ground implications of the process far more than what happens underground. The idea that you can inject fluid and a little bit of sand under pressure at a mile or a mile and a half below the surface and somehow have this stuff creep up into your drinking water is it's remote. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Could I live to be 500? Yeah, I could live to be 500. Is it likely? It's unlikely. And I know Scott will have some comments about that because he's good at that. So what I worry about is, you know, when we put these chemicals, and most of it's water, into the formation, it contacts the petroleum system, and things come back that we didn't put in. Things that are part of the natural petroleum system, things like benzene, things like toluene, sometimes even some mildly radioactive salts. So I worry about what happens to the fluids when they come back to the surface. Are they put into containment areas that prevent them from leaking into the soil? Are they put into treatment facilities that are designed to actually remove those things, as opposed, for instance, to simple water treatment facilities, which is where a lot of that stuff goes? If I give the returned water to Joe to haul to some treatment facility, and Joe decides to dump it in the creek because it's cheaper and quicker for him, well, that worries me a lot. So I'm very concerned about the human side of things, really. It's not the mechanical process, and we don't want to get into this. There are all sorts of things that can and will go wrong with any industrial scale process, and we're talking about an industrial scale process here. People will make mistakes, and there will be accidents. I'm not here to apologize for that possibility or the fact that that has happened. But to return to where I started, it's my view that fracking, if done correctly, is safe.
I'll let you go. Yeah.
So 2 quick areas. I mean, in case you don't know the process, just very briefly, an analogy, it'd be like taking your hydraulic car jack, hydraulic fracturing, and putting it under this building if this were solid rock, and pumping away until your hydraulic jack failed, because it wouldn't lift the building, and it would rupture, and it would rupture the concrete foundation for a while, but it wouldn't propagate all the way to the surface. So that doesn't happen if you're far enough away from the aquifer. People think it does because they've seen some films that are misleading. That's created a lot of fervor. Completely agree with what Art said. Stuff at the surface has always happened in oil and gas operations. Those operators who don't do it well should not be allowed to operate, period. If they go rogue, they go away in any industry. And we can get better across the board in regulations, okay? And it's happening. Lots of things that are being done. What's the federal rule? Limited. State rule, large. Good partnership there with industry and academics to do it well. The bigger question I ask, though, a different way to look at this, if you don't like hydraulic fracturing, that's fine. Then you must like nuclear. And if you don't like nuclear, you love coal. And I say this to students, and they visibly back up and get pained looks in their eyes. I don't like nuclear, I don't like coal, and I don't like fracking. And I say, well, you can't not like everything. Do you like electricity? And they admit, charging the cell phone, plugging in the plug-in hybrid, yeah, I need electricity. So what part of those 3 baseload options don't you like the least? Because right now, the alternatives for power gen, hydro, which is great, but we can't do much more, and the renewables, are small. They're growing, but they're small. Those are the baseload options. The problem we have with people who are allowed to pontificate about what they don't like is we don't ask them what they do like, because it's usually nothing. I'm not that concerned about hydraulic fracturing because relative to the other 2, it's pretty good environmentally. They all have risks. The impact of those risks in fracking is local and smaller. We know what it is with coal. And now and then, nuclear has larger events, but it's rare. On a kilowatt-hour basis, nuclear energy is the safest of all in the world. That's just a fact. You can check it. Options. We have to start to ask people for options. What would you do?
So I'm not going to reiterate anything that was said. I agree with everything that's been said so far. The one thing I will note, though, is that I think in terms of mitigating environmental concerns, this is a role. This is a place where technology has a critical role. And I know a lot of the firms that are operating in the shale formations around the country now are already looking at ways to recycle and reuse water, ways to mitigate water withdrawal, because this is a tremendous issue when you talk about hydraulically fracturing wells, say, in the Eagle Ford Shale in South Texas, because you're talking about an area that's in the middle of a drought. So these issues are very, very important, but I think technology has a tremendous role here. One of the things that sort of gets lost in that discussion, though, is the role that policy can play in encouraging the adoption of new technologies. As a matter of fact, policy can play a pretty important role in a lot of things. Scott and I were, before this, talking about the flaring of natural gas in the Bakken Shale and how policy really didn't do anything to try to prohibit that. So. But this is just one example. But when you talk about policy, one of the things you have to realize in the United States, it's not a federal policy or a federal set of policies that really governs oil and gas developments. It's a collection of state and local and regional policies. And I found that incredibly interesting because there are states that do look to other states as sort of examples, right? How do we look to see, if I'm in the state of Arkansas, what Oklahoma's doing? How can I learn from that in terms of forming regulatory guidance around oil and gas operations? I was recently, I guess it was recently, about 2 months ago, I spoke at a conference by the National Governors Association. It was a really interesting event. But one thing that I noticed, and I had to ask the question, and I thought it was a tremendous failure, to be honest with you, is that you have representatives from almost every oil and gas producing state in the audience. State offices, some of the governors were there, involved in some roundtable discussions about what they're doing around shale operations in their state. There was nobody from the state of Texas there. Except for me, yeah. Me, yeah, but I mean, but you get the point, right? I mean, you're talking about the largest oil and gas producing state in the country, yet there's not a single representative from any of our state agencies in this forum. And to me, that's a travesty. It turns out there's a history there, and I won't go into it, but the point is, if we're going to see appropriate policy design, appropriate regulatory mechanisms put in place, it's important that the states communicate. It's important that they all learn from one another, because if they don't, then you end up with failures, and guess what happens then? It becomes a federal issue. I don't think anybody involved in the industry wants that.
Let me just follow up on this issue of environmental impact. And Art, this is something you and I have talked about before. The nature of fracking, and this gets to the issue of decline rates, and maybe you could explain that a little bit, but it also means that we're likely to be drilling more wells over time, and that has an environmental impact as well, even if they're all drilled properly and to environmental standards. So maybe you could expound on that a little bit.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Loren. That really is the underlying fear when I talk to town hall meetings in New York and Pennsylvania, places that are being reintroduced to the oil and gas business. Obviously, the oil business started in Pennsylvania, and then it sort of took a vacation for a while. But the real concern is the footprint of all of these drilling rigs and pads and trucks and people. I mean, this is there is an undeniable economic benefit that any politician will tell you about, because he doesn't have much other good news to talk about. But there's also, a very marked change in the way all of us live around these operations. Just talk to anybody from 3 or 4 counties or 5 or 10 counties around Dallas-Fort Worth about the truck traffic, about the accidents, about the damage to the roads. Talk to people in South Texas about, where are all their revenues going? They're repairing roads, things like that. But the hard fact of the matter is that we are pursuing poorer and poorer reservoirs. We have been for a long time, and now we're getting to some really lousy ones. They're non-reservoirs with shale. We've invented some technologies which allow us to produce oil and gas from them. That's a good thing. And the bad thing is, number one, it costs a whole lot more than it did to produce similar volumes or higher volumes from conventional reservoirs, and they don't last as long. These wells give up a huge amount of their ultimate production, in the first year or first couple of years. And so because the decline rates are so high, and just to give you an idea, whether we're talking about gas or oil from shale, the decline rates are at least 10 times greater than from conventional reservoirs. And that's not my opinion. That's historical information. You can look it up. So what that means is that we got to drill more wells all the time. And for instance, in the Eagle Ford Shale, which has been such a benefit to the Texas economy, 75% of the oil produced down there is from wells that started producing in the last 18 months. 95% of the oil is from wells that started producing in the last 30 months. So this is just-in-time production. And once you get started with one of these things, you never get to stop. Conventional oil field, yeah, it's a messy thing when you're infilling and developing, and then you get to a point where you don't have to do very much for a number of years and things grow back and you start making money. It doesn't work that way with shale. You never get to stop drilling. So the question is, we're in a different dimension here, and it's a treadmill. And yes, we can continue to provide energy. I don't think anybody at this table is going to dispute the fact that the resources are tremendous, enormous. How much of that will actually get commercially produced? I think we've laid out, all of those parameters as well. It has to do with available capital, supply, demand, technology, et cetera. The last thing I'll say, I want to leave you with, if you have the idea that because it's shale, that we're not bound by the same constraints of the laws of physics as we were with conventional production, then let me correct that. Oil and gas is always found in discrete deposits, which we used to call fields. Now they're called sweet spots. Just because it's shale doesn't mean it's an infinite trough that we can keep going back to forever. It is a very large resource. I agree with that, but it doesn't differ materially from the way oil and gas has always been produced.
That actually sets up the next segment of this presentation very nicely, because I wanted to talk a little bit about what we need to be doing now, what we need to be doing. We have this boom. Jake actually started out by saying, let's not piss it away. So what do we do to make this worthwhile? How do we leverage this to whatever's next? And Scott, maybe you want to start us off with that.
Yeah, it's a great question. My dad was a geologist, was with Shale for 39 years, and you've heard the expression, the easy stuff has been found. And he'll grab me and say, that wasn't easy. We had old seismic and old well logs, and it was bloody hard to find. What it means is the stuff that flows easily has been found, and the stuff that flows more difficult, as Art's explained, is what we're doing now. It's easier to find shale, we know where they are. But it's hard to understand the system today and which parts of it are going to produce better. That's partly because we're just getting into it. I didn't learn about it in school. We're learning about it with our grad students. These are pore systems that are so small that you can, they're a few molecules across. You shrink them onto a human hair, you can't fathom. I'll give you the best description. We have a guy that runs our advanced SEM, scanning electron microscope. He said, Scott, I took a cubic millimeter of rock, that's the little spacing between sort of your cubic millimeter of rock, and I migrated around in it for 2 days, and I never saw the same scene. That's where the oil and gas is coming from. So we have a lot to learn. My guess is we're not as smart as we might think we are, and we're going to learn a lot. We're going to learn a lot about these systems as they develop, just like we did with conventional reservoirs. We'll probably get better at producing from them if there's demand for that product out there. It may become too expensive. That's going to be compared to what? What are the options that are more affordable? If there aren't any, we're going to continue to develop and produce from these large resource plays that we have. The other part was environmental, was that? Is that what you were?
Yeah, but let's follow along this line, because earlier when you were listing the sources of things we don't like, and I think some people would have said, well, why can't we just use wind and solar, right? I mean, that's environmentally much better, much less damaging. Why don't we just do that?
Yeah. Well, nothing's perfect, and so everything has its costs, whether they're environmental or economic or social. And if you start to look at them objectively, kind of take your own favorites out and just look at them objectively, you can see where their pros are and what their cons are. The biggest challenge is scale. Can I scale these things to meet the demand that exists amongst us? 7.1 billion people on Earth. 1.5 billion have no electricity. 3 billion have very little modern energy. They want it. Another 2 billion are just starting to industrialize. So the demand is tremendous. How do we scale all that to happen in a way that is environmentally sensitive? The challenge with non-dense forms of energy, like the wind or the sun, is you got to gather them from a big area and make them dense so we can use them to light these lights. Electricity is dense. So that's the challenge. There's environmental costs in land, in water, in atmospheric releases across all forms of energy. And I think it's just the challenge that we need to think about and be pretty objective and balance the portfolio. The biggest thing I think that I would say to all of this is what shale has bought us, to me, is some time. It's bought 10, 20, 30 years to economically think about where we're going in the future, to be smart this time. Let's not piss it away. To me, what that means is let's invest in things that we know are coming 30 years out. Will we do it? Ken?
Well, that's a great question. I think Scott hit on something that's really important here. When you talk about the energy system, the biggest issue is scale. My energy economics courses, when I get to talking about electricity markets, invariably students will ask, why can't we be more like France? They get so much electricity from nuclear. And I say, well, how big do you think the French nuclear power fleet is? They have no clue, because they don't know anything about scale. They just know what they read, right? I say, how big do you think the U.S. nuclear fleet is? It's about 2.5 times the size of the French nuclear fleet. So what's the difference? The French power market's about the size of the Texas power market. So it's a scale issue, right? So if you're going to talk about, moving into sort of new paradigms, you've got to recognize the scale of the problem. That's a really, really important issue. So far, in the United States, I would view, some people say we don't have an energy policy. In point of fact, that is an energy policy. Right? Letting the market determine, where capital is best directed and sort of letting the chips fall where they may. And I would argue that built on the strength of the U.S. economy over the last 100 years, it's been a pretty good success story. Really what I'm saying is market forces do a pretty good job of figuring out where capital should be allocated. And at the end of the day, I think that's the path we need to continue along. Now, does that mean there's not a role for government to be thinking about funding initiatives to look at new, very basic, very core research and development endeavors? Absolutely there's a role for that. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, when you look at shale, where do you think it started? It actually started with a DOE-led initiative. It was a little over 30 years ago. But look where we are today. But that's the critical piece. Try to get a politician to talk 30 years into the future. It's virtually impossible. But we've got to rethink, the way we approach the energy system. We've got to recondition ourselves to be thinking about long-term types of initiatives, because trying to steer the energy market is like trying to turn a VLCC. You can't do it on a dime.
Can I say one thing?
Sure, yeah.
I get asked quite often, Scott, why don't we have a national energy policy? And I look back, I say, do you really want one? Who would write it? And would it work as well as sort of the latest national event that we have going on here the last 3 months? How would it work? So I completely agree with Ken that we don't want to codify that. Quite often, policymakers want to pick winners. Bad idea. Not frame it in a context that's long-term. lots of things that go on there. So careful with independence and careful with national energy policies. It may just not be the direction that makes the most sense.
Yeah, I sure agree with that. Whenever government gets involved in, well, almost anything, but particularly energy, which, even those in government who claim to be experts in energy, well, relative to the rest of the crowd, I guess that's probably true. I have yet to meet anybody in Congress that really has the time to deal with the complexity of energy. So I'm with these guys. Better that they don't mess with it anymore than they already have. But I do fear, as I started saying a little while ago, that the kind of information that we get from the media, and it's not their fault, the kind of information we get from our government trying to make a good story really is not very productive towards the question that Loren asked, which is the right question, which is, what Jake asked: how are we not going to piss this away? And if the message that we're all getting is, hey, move over, OPEC, we're the big dogs on the block now. We're gonna be supplying you with energy. We got so much, it's coming out of our ears. Well, that's not exactly the message that gets people to think carefully about the next 30 years, much less the next 3 minutes. That's why I said, go out and buy a Hummer again. We can afford to do that now. So I think we have to be careful. To Scott's point about shale has bought us some time. I don't for a minute think that we should be doing anything other than what we are doing. We have to develop this resource because it's all we got left that's big enough to meet our needs. So I absolutely agree. Now, we have different opinions on maybe how well that's being done. I can be very critical of the way industry's doing it, but then again, we're an undisciplined lot. And we are also pretty good at coming up with solutions after we make a lot of mistakes. So I would encourage people to not be too swayed by the good news, and to remember that we've bought ourselves some more time. It's costing us an awful lot of money. We talk about how we don't want to send our petrodollars to someone else. Well, the reason this is happening is because consumers are now forced to pay the same amount to American providers as we've been paying to foreign providers. And it's better economically, there's no doubt about it. But the consumer is not really getting a deal on this thing. So all is not good news. It's better news than we've had, but we've got to be careful about how we use it, and we also have to be mindful of the fact that this is not the end of history. That we're going to be up against the same problems we've always been up against, whether it be with oil or with natural gas, much sooner than most people want to admit.
Two quick things. So some good trends on the fracking side. We're drilling multiple wells from single pads now. So in the Marcellus, for example, 4 to 8 wells from a single pad is routine. That reduces some of the surface footprint. Starting to recycle and reuse the flowback and produce water from the wells. So using the old oceans that are stuck in the shales to re-inject and do the fracking instead of fresh water. As much fresh water, that's a good thing. Starting to reduce the chemicals that go in there, which are 1%, but that's still 1% of several million gallons. It's not trivial. So, and I could keep going. A lot of good things, but they should continue and get better. The other good thing about shale to me is it's geopolitically diversified. There are shales around the world that are not current oil and gas headquarters, if you will. Okay? So it's creating a much more diverse supply market than currently exists. And that has some folks worried. If you dig deep into some of the funding for anti-fracking propaganda, you can trace it back to Moscow. Mr. Putin is very nervous. You can trace it back to the Middle East. Certain films that are funded from the United Arab Emirates and other places. You can check these facts. And why is that? They need to deliver their conventional resources to markets. Moscow has to deliver cheap conventional gas to Europe. They really don't want shale gas coming on too quickly. The Middle East needs to deliver through the Straits of Hormuz conventional oil to the world. They really don't want shale coming. They have it. It's not that they don't like it. All those conventional reservoirs were sourced somewhere. They have it, and they will begin to develop it at the right time. That's the politics. Things energy are never what they seem. But I like the idea of a lot broader source, if you will, of supply globally, because it creates a lot more options. And eventually, natural gas even becomes a fungible physical commodity as it's traded on LNG tankers like oil tankers.
Just to clarify, Art, you weren't advocating price controls or anything like
Not
that
at all.
in your statement?
No way.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I didn't misunderstand you, so.
Sorry.
Okay.
Got us both on that.
Well, let's, I want to wrap up the sort of this part of the presentation and leave time for questions, but maybe the best way to kind of end things would just be to ask each of you, recognizing the fact that most predictions about energy have proven to be wrong over time, nevertheless, if each of you could kind of give your view of what you see our energy landscape looking like 50 years from now. Or 20 years, whatever time frame you feel more comfortable with.
I'll start this off. Yeah, I'll start this off. I'll start it off with kind of a little anecdote. But when I was working on my doctoral thesis, one of my advisors actually gave me some pretty sage advice. He said, never be afraid to forecast. And I was like, because you're sitting there as a PhD student, you're worried about whether or not your forecast is going to be reasonable, and you just get into the weeds on a lot of things. And so I was talking to him about, he says, don't be afraid to forecast. I was like, really, why? He said, well, first of all, you're going to be wrong. He said, second of all, nobody's going to remember what you said 6 months from now anyway. So, that's a really good piece of advice.
We're recording this.
Yeah, absolutely. I have no problem with that. So if you ask me to look, 20 years into the future, I actually do see U.S. demand not much higher than where it is today when we talk about crude oil. Natural gas, I think, however, is a little bit different issue because I think there's tremendous expansion capability and opportunity there that's going to be capitalized upon. Production in the U.S., I actually see it up on both counts 20 years from now, given where we are today. We won't be energy independent. Renewables will continue to push their way into the system, largely supported by government aid. But they're not going to make up 10 or 15% of the mix. It's still going to be largely dominated by coal, oil, and natural gas. Now, the one that's going to lose over the next 20 years, and I think the writing's on the wall, and there's this sort of what's been termed the war on coal, I think coal's going to lose in the U.S. energy mix. Now, does that mean we're going to stop producing coal? Absolutely not. I think what you'll see is a lot more exports of coal from the United States to other parts of the world. So king coal is not going away, if you want to sort of want me to think about how the industries are going to respond. But I do see growth in natural gas, in particular in the United States. Modest growth in crude oil, mostly on the production side, not on the consumption side, and some modest growth in renewables. But I think a lot of this is really just going to pave the way for new technologies to matriculate into the system, new technologies that potentially could be transformative. I think the one technology that a lot of people are putting a lot of time and effort to, particularly in R&D labs and universities and in the national labs, is storage technologies for electricity. And that's something that's often left out of the conversation. But if you look at our nation's electricity mix, it's highly flexible, lots of different forms of generation, but that's by necessity because the load on a given day fluctuates so tremendously, you need that flexibility. If you introduce storage, commercial scale storage, it dramatically changes everything we're talking about up here, everything. Because now you can super scale baseload generation technology, run it 24/7, store when demand's low, release it out of storage when demand's high, and you get rid of the need for all these peaking facilities. That's transformative. That's the kind of thing that the government ought to be really focused on, because then everything we're saying up here gets thrown for a loop.
I believe that the contribution from shale is real and will continue. I believe it will cost considerably more than most people think, particularly on the natural gas side. And I say that simply because it currently costs a whole lot more than the price just to produce the stuff, so eventually that's going to equalize. Having said that, I thoroughly agree with Ken's observation that the North American economy, not just the U.S., will increasingly rely on natural gas for the simple reason that we've got a lot more of it than we do of oil. I don't see oil production continuing to grow for very much longer. I've studied the Eagle Ford, I've studied the Bakken, done predictions for clients on, how much longer do we have, and the answer is it depends. I mean, that's always the answer you'll get from an analyst. But yeah, it depends on a lot of things. But the truth is that if you look at what's currently commercial and make the assumption, and I agree with Ken on this, that as long as we stay in this $80, $90, $100, $110 range. We can pretty much say what that is. How many wells are currently producing, and giving some spacing or infill scenarios, how many more locations are left? I mean, it is finite. And when you do that, you come up with something like 5 to 7 or 8 years, and then we're fully developed. Does that mean the production's over? No. It just means that you've drilled as many wells under those constraints as you can. So I think that the Department of Energy, for a change, has things generally right, that oil production will increase for another 5 years or 6 years, and then it'll kind of slowly decline. Natural gas is another story. We just have to be prepared to spend more money. And let's face it, natural gas is a bargain at $7 or $8 per 1,000 cubic feet, as opposed to the 350 or 4 range that we're in, just in terms of its energy content. And it's clean, and we've got a lot of it, and so we will go in that direction. Agree with Scott. Renewables are, a very nice dream, and they will grow. I read a calculation not too long ago that at the current rate of conversion, it'll take 1,000 years to get off of fossil fuels. Now, that makes some straight line assumptions, but it gives you an idea of the magnitude. The amount of our primary energy consumption that comes from renewables is a couple of %, and you just don't make those kind of changes wholesale. So the other thing, and I'm all for renewables, but there's an awful lot of hidden fossil fuel costs in those things. I mean, you don't make a wind turbine with wind. I mean, you make it in a factory, and you use electricity from coal or natural gas, and people tend to forget those things. So, I mean, I think we're going in a direction that we can view as either positive or negative. It depends on whether we choose to piss it away and how we do that. We've got enough for a little while. We don't have enough to continue without changing our behavior. We are changing our behavior, some of it for reasons of efficiency, some of it because we just can't afford to pay what we used to. Our carrying costs, we can't compete with China and India. So I think we've got some tougher times ahead than the headlines would allow you to think. That doesn't mean I'm negative about it. I just think it's going to cost more.
Somebody came up to me after one of my talks and said, Scott, electricity travels a lot faster than sound. Yeah. I said, well, that's why some people look so bright until you hear them speak. So everything I say probably won't be very bright from this point, because we're in the forecasting world. If you want to see the description of the future that I think is going to happen, watch Switch. It's at the end there. And it's very much along the lines of these that Ken and Art have talked about. Goes to 20% renewables in 2080. It's not my prescription. It's not my hope or dream. It's just a description, and it won't be right. It worries a lot of people because we're going to put a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. Not a real popular topic in Texas, but I promise you it's popular around the world. And what greenhouse gases do when you get into a 550 ppm atmospheric world, which is what my description of the future takes you to. Okay? The last thing I'll say, and other than a couple of real bright youngsters I see over here in the third row, Thank you guys for coming. How old are you, about 10? 8.5.
Excellent.
I am glad you're here.
Yes.
I hope anything we've said makes sense, because we need you. But for the rest of you who look like you'll remember this reference, remember The Graduate? I'm going to say one word, right? Plastics. Well, I'm going to say one word, and Ken said it too: storage. That is the black swan. And what do I mean by that? Storage that's affordable, reliable, and scalable. And that's not easy. You know, your batteries and your cell phones. There are lots of things being worked on to store energy at scale, but affordable and reliable. If that comes about, and as it does, and it'd be a great set of investments for governments to make, then the world changes. You truly see a remarkable change in all things energy, because the turbines can turn and you're capturing the energy for when you need it later. Same with the sun. Okay, so that's the big one, and I'd love to see it happen. I'd like to invest in it. But until that time, you've got some certain set of fundamental principles that keep efficiency of not very dense forms of energy at a certain level, a certain percentage.